Well, what the conferences has been, it's been a pleasure to discuss all the panels, but we have the last one, which is not a panel, it's a presentation. It's a very special one because it's the annual EU Tax Observatory Young Researchers Award. The title of our conference is Investing in the Future of Europe, and there is a different kind of investment that we can make, that of research. And since we are an independent research center based in the EU, we do honor this kind of investment. So this year, we had a very difficult choice, a committee of 4 members to decide. The quality has gone significantly up in the papers that we have seen, but we have decided on a paper that is very timely. It looks at enablers, which is a very policy-relevant topic. And at the same time, it uses new data, which is another criterion that we use. And the award goes to Johannes Schurer for his work on enablers. So if he's around, yes. And I can give you the floor for a 20-minute presentation of your work, which I'm sure we will be all happy to see. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Panos. And first of all, thanks a lot to the organizers for such a great conference and for giving me the chance to be part of the program. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm truly honored to receive this recognition. But I have to say, I do not deserve the credit all by myself. This is joint work with my friend Julia Brun-Bjørkheim from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And the main point that we try to make in this paper is to emphasize that anti-profit shifting legislations are important, but they do come at significant costs. And in particular, the financial burdens of firms complying with these regulations and those of the governments enforcing these regulations should be taken into account when designing these policies. All right, so I don't think I have to convince you that multinational profit shifting is a sizable phenomenon worldwide. So we heard this today from Ruud and Gabriel. And a lot of research to date has been devoted to understanding the various ways in which multinational profit shifting happens and their impact on government revenues. Only recently, there are more and more papers coming out emphasizing that the consequences of profit shifting go far beyond missing tax receipts. So just to mention a few, there's one paper by Gauss et al. Finding that profit shifting impinges upon product market outcomes. And in particular, they find that tax avoidance by multinationals puts their national competitors at a competitive disadvantage. In another project that we have with Annette Alsterset and Ron Davies, we also find, using very similar data to as we use in this paper, that profit shifting fosters income inequality by only favoring those people at the very top of the income distribution, like CEOs and managers. So all of these findings, they spur policy responses and reiterate the need for some regulations to tackle this profit-shifting behavior. But now there's the big but. These regulations do not come without costs. First of all, firms have to incur costs complying with these regulations, and also governments and tax authorities, they spend various resources implementing these regulations. Besides these obvious monetary costs, there are also efficiency costs from implementing anti-tax avoidance legislations. For instance, Ruud has a paper showing that TP regulations may divert resources away from productive investment and actually reduce the productivity of firms. Also, there's a recent paper from France confirming these results and also showing that this also spills over to affiliates of these affected multinationals in low-tax countries. But overall, there's very limited evidence on the effectiveness of anti-profit shifting legislations, and in particular, we lack a complete understanding of the compliance costs of these firms. So there's mostly anecdotal evidence showing that tax advisors, they do play a role. So for instance, there's a paper that is that's very close to ours. It's by Bustos et al. Also Gabriel is involved in there. And they find, studying a reform in Chile, that it has no significant effect on tax payments, but it significantly increased the number of tax experts at the Big Four companies. And this already alludes to the significant compliance costs associated with these regulations. All right, so what we do in this paper is that we focus on one particularly quantitatively important channel of profit shifting, that is the strategic distortion of intra-firm prices. And the question that we're gonna ask is, as the TP regulations become more and more prevalent, how much do firms spend in complying or circumventing these regulations? And to do so, we use administrative data from Norway to study the effectiveness and the compliance costs of a TP reform that was implemented in 2008. And what do we find? Is we find significant evidence of tax-motivated transfer mispricing. So firms, MNEs in Norway, they sell too cheaply to their affiliates in low-tax countries and buy expensively from them. We find like effects of around 3 to 4%. We also show that compliance costs are highest for firms with affiliates in tax haven countries, and for those firms that cluster around zero return on assets, so those who appear least profitable. We also find that profits and tax payments, they do go up in Norway after this reform. We actually find no effect on trade prices, but this increases in tax payments and profits. They pale in comparison to the effect or the expenses on tax advisory services. So this is, these are like the main findings of the paper. So a little bit on the institutional background, what happened in Norway? So Norway introduced stricter TP legislations in 2008. Before 2008, there were some general TP guidelines in place stating that intra-firm trade prices should be stated at arm's length, meaning as if the trade was with an unrelated party, but enforcement was basically incomplete and lacking. Now in 2008, firms that have controlled transactions over 10 million Norwegian kroners or exceed a threshold of internal debt, they had to file a separate tax form in addition to the corporate tax return, documenting the extent and nature of these transactions. And the second part was the documentation requirement showing or where firms, where affected firms exceeding specific size thresholds had to justify and document their intra-firm trade prices. At the same time, the Norwegian tax administration significantly increased its auditing efforts and issued annual reports with like TP cases and tax revenues gained. Yeah. So this is the form RF 1123. That this is the extra tax form that affected multinationals had to file. The first part is about their ownership structure, but also firms had to report very detailed picture of the controlled transactions. Like we have various categories of these transactions, and firms, they had to state like gross numbers, how much of these transactions are like controlled, and where these transactions go to. I have to say that up to this point, we haven't used this form yet because we only recently got access to this data from the tax authorities. But this is something that will come in the near future. So what kind of data do we use? So as I said, we study Norway, and we use administrative data from Statistics Norway over the period 2005 to 2013. We have very rich accounting and tax data on Norwegian firms with their tax payments, their profits report, their industry affiliation, and so on. We also have information on the foreign activities. So at the 8-digit product level, we observe the value of each transaction, where it goes to, and we also have information on the ownership structure of these firms. We see where the foreign affiliates and where the shareholders are. So we also can identify firms with ownership linkages to tax havens. What is novel in our data is that we can approximate spending on tax advisory services. So we match our firm level data with worker records for the population of for the universe of the Norwegian populations, and we have very detailed information of the occupations of these workers. And so we tease out who is a tax lawyer, who is a consultant, who is an accountant, who is an economist. In the analysis, we actually exclude economists, and we use their wage information to approximate in-house spending on tax advisory services. We also have a variable that includes fees for foreign expenses, and this is specifically targeted to accountants, lawyers, and auditors. So this is our proxy for spending on external consultants. All right, and what we then do, we use a simple difference in differences framework to study the effect of the reform on affected firms, on otherwise unaffected firms, but who are still internationally active. So we do a lot of work to kind of arrive at an apples-to-apples comparison. Okay, so as we know so little on tax advisory spending, let's have a brief look at the data. So here I plot the average spending on tax advisors for different kinds of firms. And what we see is that advisory spending is highest for multinationals in general, and in particular for those multinationals with ownership linkages to tax havens. So external expenses, they amount to around 40 million Norwegian kroners, which is around about 3 million euros. And a similar pattern emerges for in-house advisors. But as we have only comparatively few consultants in-house, the average is obviously much lower. If you look at this by the number of affiliates, we also see that firms with more affiliates, with more complex ownership structures, they spend far more on tax advisory services, both in-house and out-house. But if we scale this by a measure of firm size, this picture actually kind of reverts. So firms with fewer affiliates or with a less complex ownership structure, compliance costs, so to say, or tax advisory spending plays a disproportionately higher role for these firms. If we look at the return on assets, so a measure of profitability, and splitting this into different deciles, we see that those firms clustering around 0 assets have by far the most expenses on tax advisory services, both in-house and out-house. So in the first part of the paper, we actually provide a very comprehensive descriptive analysis of this new data. All right. So if you look at the effect of the reform on external fees and the wages for the in-house tax specialists, we see that both increased significantly after the reform was implemented. Okay? So the reform happened in 2008, and wages respond with a bit of a delay, but we do see significant effect on both margins. If you look at reported profits and tax payments, we also see that they go up. Okay? So the reform seems to be effective in that it raises reported profits and tax payments, but it also increases significantly the tax advisory spending. So to put this into context, our estimates suggest that spending on external tax advisors increased roundabout by 12.5% and on in-house consultants by 150%. But we also have to keep in mind that the market for external tax advisors is much bigger than for internal. So the external, we calculate that around 50 billion Norwegian kroners are spent on external advisory services compared to 1 billion kroners internally. And then we conduct some back-of-the-envelope calculations. And from our estimates, we infer that tax advisory spending, both in-house and out-house, increased in total by 9 billion Norwegian kroners in the year after the reform, or boiling this down to per MNE. This amounts to around about 4.6 million Norwegian kroner. So a significant increase in tax advisory spending. At the same time, from the annual reports of the Norwegian Tax Administration, they only report an increase in tax payments of round about 0.2 billion Norwegian kroner. So in other words, tax advisory spending appears to be much more or much higher compared to actually the additional tax revenue that was raised by the Norwegian government. But I have to say at this point, this work is still very preliminary, so please keep this in mind when we talk about the magnitude of these effects. Now, is this driven by firms in tax haven? It doesn't seem so. So the bottom line is that the reform puts compliance costs on all firms, but it's not only the multinationals with affiliates in tax havens that seem to react to this reform, okay? Now, to wrap up, what is the big picture? We know that multinational firms, they engage in profit shifting, for instance, by mispricing the intra-firm trade, and this has detrimental effects on the economy. That's why we need regulations. But it is important to keep in mind, these regulations, they do not come without costs. Here we only have, or try to estimate the compliance cost of firms. Our calculations, they do not include the costs of governments and tax authorities implementing these rules. And what we find is, first of all, transfer mispricing is relevant in Norway. And after the TP reform, tax advisory spending increased significantly, and it seems to outstrip the additional tax revenues by far. So, and this is the bottom line of the paper. Regulations are good, but we have to understand the complete compliance picture to fully grasp their scope. Yeah. Thanks a lot for your attention.